Hi, everybody. Thank you for showing up today and for taking time out of your day for to join this screening and this Q&A. We're so lucky to have with us Helena Norberg-Hodge herself, the founder of the Local Futures Movement, filmmaker, Emmy Award filmmaker Cyrus Sutton, who made the film Closer to Home, which we're excited to show in the screening today, and writer, philosopher Bayo Akomolafe, who is featured in the film. We're very honored to have him as well. And I'll be going into their bios a little more. But as Helena mentioned, if you just want to pop into the chat where you're calling in from, also, if you know the ancestral lands of where you're calling in from, for example, I'm calling in from upstate New York, otherwise known as Lenape lands. And maybe even where the lands that you call from. For example, I am from the Quechua lands of now what we call Peru, raised in Gadigal lands, what is now known as Australia. So just a nice way to kind of introduce ourselves. But I want to thank you all for showing up. Maybe you showed up today because you saw an Instagram post, because you're excited to have a Q&A and talk directly with Helena herself, and hear from Bayo and Cyrus about their role in making and producing and featuring in this film. Maybe you've shown up because you or someone in your family is very ill and you are looking at the food system as perhaps the culprit. Maybe you think it's ridiculous that food flown halfway across the world in a supermarket is cheaper than the butternut squash growing just a few miles away from where you live, and you think that something's wrong with the system that sprays weapons of mass destruction on our food and then sells them to us and tells them that they're safe to eat. Or maybe you just feel a nagging feeling of discontent and disillusionment with the current system, and you're looking for another way forward, a message of hope, which is really what this film is and what Helena's message is all about. So for those of you who are not yet familiar with Helena's work, I'm going to read you her bio. Helena is a pioneer of the New Economy movement and the recipient of both the Right Livelihood Award and the Goy Peace Prize. Through books, articles, interviews, films, and public lectures on 5 continents, she's been promoting an economics of personal, social, and ecological well-being for more than 40 years. She's the author of the inspirational classic Ancient Futures, the producer and co-director of the award-winning film The Economics of Happiness, and the founder and director of Local Futures. Welcome, Helena. We also have the director of the film today, Cyrus Sutton, who's an Emmy Award-winning director, and he's also a professional surfer. And his career as a short film director has led to numerous awards. In 2018, his documentary Island Earth won multiple awards and helped proliferate the growing food sovereignty movement in Hawaii. And then we're so lucky to have Bayo Akomolafe, philosopher, writer, and also contributing voice in the film from Nigeria/India. He is passionate about nature, has co-founded Eco Universidade, an educational platform that drives systemic change by facilitating dialogues between different worldviews and opening space for more regenerative human presence on Earth. Wait, this is Thaisa's one. Excuse me. This bio is a little, Bayo's bio is a little mixed up, but I think I've got the right part here. He blurs the lines between the personal and political. His playful and poetic voice calls us to unlearn, rethink, and radically imagine the world and our role within it. He's the author of the books These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home, We Will Tell Our Own Story, The Lions for Africa Speak, and he's also the founder and chief curator of the Emergence Network, and I am one of his huge fans, and I'm so honored to be on this panel with him today. So we're going to go into the movie screening first, unless Helena, you'd like to say you're welcome.
I just want to thank you, Nathalie, so much for hosting this and also for the lovely video you made on Instagram. I almost feel we should show it if it's possible. It was so beautifully done and with a very succinct message. And also big thanks to Bayo, who is so in demand that he barely has time to speak to you, and being invited here, there, and everywhere in the world as one of the great thinkers, writers, systems thinkers. So very happy that we've been collaborating since 20 2013, isn't it? I think 2013. And to Cyrus, a new friend and also an incredibly loved person for his multiple skills and his commitment to nature-based living, and a very good filmmaker, but also someone who's building community and deep connections to nature. Thank you so much, and look forward to a discussion after the film. And maybe also just say for people to be aware that what we're trying to lay out in very simple terms about the dominant narrative and the big picture, which is essentially about a sort of corporate empire behind the scenes ruling our governments. Governments are signing over their right to protect the environment, to protect our jobs, to global corporations. It's actually a process that has accelerated and become absolutely absurd since the mid-80s. And since that time, I've been watching it with colleagues like Vandana Shiva and others. And we really believe that this is the missing piece in what represents an intuitive, enormous cultural turning as people have been pulled into the urban, and I'm talking about the mega city, urban, high-rise, consumer culture living. People there develop a thirst for community and deep connections to the animals, to the plants, to the living earth that is our only home, our only economy. So there's this huge cultural turning. The missing piece is, how do we get a stronger economic literacy from the people who are so in love with the earth and who are moving back home to Mother Gaia, but often thinking, oh, that big system, we know all about it, and we know it's no good. We don't need to talk about it, but we actually do, because there is a very clear way that we could bring back the power and allow a major turning to happen. So please don't think of that big picture as depressing. It's an enormous opportunity to support and strengthen what is already a huge cultural turning. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So I'm sure everybody has come prepared with questions, and we'll get time for that after the screening, which we're going to start right now. Thank you to Helena and Cyrus for that beautiful film, and Bayo as well for his contribution. Every time I watch it, I feel I understand a different piece of the puzzle, and I feel hopeful about what a different path forward could look like. So this is the time for the Q&A, but I'm going to start us off with some questions of my own. And I will, oh my goodness, sorry, somebody's tuning in from La Union, Huánuco, and it's my cousin. Oh my goodness, hi Javier. So La Union, Huánuco, so where I'm from is the Andes of Peru. My people are Quechua. My grandmother still speaks Quechua. I'm in the process of relearning Quechua. Our ancestral foods, some of you may know, are quinoa, potato, corn. And when I went back to Peru for the first time, I was devastated to see that locals could not afford to eat quinoa anymore, an ancestral food that has nourished us for thousands of years. And that's because quinoa has become a hot superfood on the international market. And people like me and my friends eat it overseas, thinking we're, taking care of our health and our bodies by eating this amazing Inca superfood as it is packaged and marketed to us, not understanding that now the people of Peru, the indigenous people of Peru, are forced to eat imported rice, which is not as nutritious, which obviously has traveled thousands of miles. It comes from China. So I'm going to start off with this example and put this question to Helena. What do you say to people who would just counter that this is just part of progress? This is just some inevitable step down this human evolutionary path, and that the times of growing our own food and growing these ancestral foods and eating them ourselves are of the past, and that to be progressive and modern, to look forward to the future, is to succumb to this global trade economy.
Well, what I say is that we really need to step back to understand that the modern economy started after colonialism and slavery. And what had happened is that global traders had benefited from trade in people, literally slaves, and from driving people in both the so-called rich countries and the so-called poor countries away from producing a range of foods for themselves. I am so excited by the knowledge that nowhere that I know of in the modern era has there been well-funded research to look at the amazing diversity that could be produced around the world. I know that, for instance, in Ladakh in the Himalayas, you can grow quinoa. I know that in Australia, they are growing quinoa. And this is not because of any help from well-funded academic research or any help from government. It's the initiative of people who have tried to really enrich their own local economy. If we could have support to do that, there would be, if not quinoa, there'd be relatives like amaranth-related grains, all kinds of grains that we don't even know the names of, that could be grown in most countries. We could have an amazing, rich diet. And of course, we could trade. But if we traded in an honest way, so that any quinoa that was brought from Peru and eaten in America or England would have the real price on it. In other words, it would cost a lot more because it would have been transported across the world. If that happened, maybe, again, removing the corporate empire, people in Peru might benefit from selling some of their grain at a very, very good price without abandoning a diversity of foods for themselves, including quinoa for their own population. But even there, the richness and diversity that could actually be created in the modern world is not been experimented with. And as you know, Natalie, there were hundreds of varieties of potatoes, for instance, and I'm sure so many different varieties of quinoa, and all of this is threatened by the corporate system. If we wake up to this bigger picture, we will realize that on every side of the world, people have lost not only the diversity of foods, the diversity of building materials, the diversity of even of fiber, fabrics, color, design, but most importantly, their happiness and health. So this very same system that is impoverishing the land is actually impoverishing all of us. We are not getting to hear the truth that progressively, and in the last 35 years, it's dramatic. I guess I say it in the film. These policies are making all of us run faster and harder just to stay in place. That means even the CEOs of Exxon and Mobil, before there was a merger, there were two CEOs, but the current path ensures that everyone is running scared because they want to be on top. So it's a fear-mongering, mega merging path that doesn't suit people. But I want to hear more from other people. So I hope that that's helpful, but we want to hear from all three of you.
Thank you,
Hi,
Helena. We're going to go to questions. I'm
Natalie,
just going to jump
Natalie,
over
Yeah,
to Bayo.
before
Bayo?
you jump, yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me good?
Yeah.
Helena, thank you for that wonderful um, uh, response to our sister's question. I just couldn't resist the temptation to also add something to it, and I'll be very brief. And it's, to those who insist that, well, this is just progress. This is progress. We're progressing. I would suggest that even progress is racialized time. It's the engineering of time itself, right? There's this very, very monolithic argument that it's between progress and conservatism. And I suggest that that's the highway. This conversation is about leaving the highway altogether because it's no longer leading to any place interesting. We see down the line and it's leading to a precipice. So progress is engineered time. Time can behave differently.
Thank you.
Wow, Bayo. Thank you so much for jumping in with that. Yeah, I think one of the things when I posted my video on Instagram inviting people to join, one of the things that really impacted people was this questioning of progress, because we've never been taught to. And so we realize we're dismantling right now this collective illusion that a lot of people are holding on to very tightly. And so, Bayo, when you illuminate this other way, this other lens for us, it's really powerful for us to start deconstructing, this, like I said, this illusion that has really enslaved us to this path that we know is, like you said, leading to this precipice that, as Helena calls, enslaving us to this death economy. So I see your questions and I'm getting to them, but I want to just tune in with Cyrus a little and ask why he was drawn to this topic, and when did food sovereignty become the issue for you, Cyrus, and what has your experience in Hawaii been, seeing these island nation states that were food sovereign become completely dependent on outside sources for food and try to reclaim that sovereignty. You're muted, Cyrus. So if you could unmute and repeat, thank you.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been an honor to work with Helena on this film, and through surfing and traveling the world, and being basically the marketing arm of corporations that sell fashion to kids, and coupling that with a really beautiful dance with nature, the cognitive dissonance that created inspired me to make the film Island Earth, and that being introduced to permaculture and place-based living, and through seeing cultures that I would visit, thinking that coming from Southern California, this endless gray grid, and going to these places that I was paid to commodify with imagery and with stories, and kind of being sold through my culture the narrative that these people that I was visiting were more simple or more primitive or something like that. Seeing that be turned on its head really early in my late teens and early 20s, and really realizing that I was impoverished, was what I think started the film Island Earth that you mentioned earlier, and which is about food sovereignty movement in Hawaii, and the fact that in a lot of permaculture courses they'll reference the Ahupua'a system, which is a ridge to sea system that basically harnesses water and effluent and nutrient to grow the most amount of calories possible in a very small area with actually not very good soils. People think Hawaii is incredibly fertile, but it's not. And it just shows the ingenuity that we once had, and it was a microcosm and a really easy way to show what we've lost, and turn over the narrative of capitalist modernity that we've all been sold. And so that was my first kind of eye-opening experience, and that was almost 10 years ago. And since then, I've been engaged and connected with a variety of amazing people, and most recently, folks like you.
Thank you, Cyrus. Maybe we'll get to this topic later, but Indigenous people all around the world have developed ingenious methods of farming in places that didn't have traditionally good soil. For example, a lot of people don't know that the Amazon was bioengineered by Indigenous people to have Tehapreta, the black earth that is a human invention, in order to enrich what was actually quite like clay, like soil with a high clay content, so not good for growing food. And out of that, they were able to bioengineer the Amazon, which is a food forest and fruit orchard created by humans. So before we get to the audience questions, I wanted to tune in with Bayo and once again say thank you so much for being here, and just ask you why you yourself have been drawn to Helena's message and this movement, and if maybe you can share a similar personal story about when this became very real for you, that where the system that we're fighting has a name, and the name is globalization, and maybe how that has tangibly impacted your community's life.
Thank you, sister. As Helena said, I've been very privileged to be in conversation with Helena for more than a decade now. And we have our hearts, beat in rhythm for a world that is suffering under a monoculture of mind, a monoculture that enlists our bodies to preserve certain kinds of realities to the exclusion of other kinds of possibilities. And, well, one might say, and it's very hard to draw, to trace an origin point here. I'm not very used to origin stories. But when I started to feel this was very early on in my young academic career, when I was exposed to the writings of Nigerian authors like Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is from Kenya. These were decolonial authors who were speaking about loss in a certain way that I didn't quite understand, because I felt, well, everything seems nice. We're going to church, right? We don't exactly have good roads, but that's something to aspire to, right? We have all these potholes. We have English, right? We have the promise of going abroad. It seemed like the architecture of my experience, naive as it was, did not account for all the undercurrents, the deeper shadows of extractivism, of language decimation, of cultural extinction, all the ways that I was coddled into a maze of sorts, a colonial comfort that did not account for the ways that, that the world is becoming, painful and leading to the suffering and the oppression of millions of people. I started to get this sense when I engaged these authors. And of course, our pathways crossed, Helena and I. And we've been in conversation ever since. What Helena speaks about as, a monoculture of mind, in what in my language I would think of as white modernity. I want to stress that, whiteness to me is not white bodies or white persons. It is a structure of experience. It's almost like a geometry of experience. See, we're talking about place here, but place is not just physical location. It's how we think. It's how we know the world. It's how we experience each other. It's how we think about food, right? I'm in Great Barrington now, and I've heard very fascinating stories. Great Barrington in Massachusetts. I've heard very fascinating stories about people planting carrots here and meeting their neighbors. And some of them don't even know what a carrot looks like, because people think a carrot comes from a shopping mall, right? The idea that it comes from soil seems cartoonish to them, right? It seems we're being conscripted into reinscribing a colonial relations. And this is what I feel is the monoculture of mind here. And, this is the call of localization, I believe, is not it's not a naive provincialism where people are all by themselves. We're not saying don't relate with each other. We're not saying don't trade with each other. Globalization is a different thing from trade, right? It should not be confused with trade. We've been trading and exchanging and sharing seeds for thousands of years. What is different here is a particular corporate capture of this very, very intimate discourse around the planet. It is the conscription of the planet to serve the needs of surplus value, the idea of profit, that we're not quite enough if we do not tend in this direction. This is white modernity. This is neurotypicality, right? This is how, for instance, France is still enacting a colonial tax on former African colonies. And I'm not sure this is part of the conversation here, but last year there were many coups in Africa, and it kind of erupted into this realization of colonial relations still being sustained between former colonies and their colonial masters and their former colonial masters. The French central bank, for instance, takes about hundreds of billions of euros every year from, through various means and purposes from their former colonial servants, so to speak. So when we speak about the underdevelopment of Africa, the cause of war, the dynamics that lead to oppression and suffering and mental dis-ease, we're not just speaking about isolated symptomatic issues. We're speaking about something deeper. We're speaking about, like I said, the shape of experience. And to cap it off, it feels like I've always been swimming in these waters. I didn't always have the language. Helena was one of the first to help usher in a language, a format, a storing device that could help me relate with loss and promise and the idea of new futures that are always possible.
Oh, goodness, Bayo, thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to get to the questions from the audience, and I still have a few of my own that I might pepper in, but I'm really conscious of the fact that you guys have tuned in to be able to chat directly and ask Helena, Bayo, and Cyrus questions directly. So the first one, Che wrote a great one. Che, I'm getting to yours later, but I'm going to start with this one, which is the big kind of question that people ask as soon as we start to point a finger at globalization, which in this monoculture of the mind has been painted to many of us as a good thing. So he says, where do we draw a trade-off between globalization and localization? What are the benefits that brought through globalization, like scientific advancement, innovation, and invention, which through globalization benefited the entire global community? So like I said, this is often the argument for globalization. Well, what about all these, scientific innovations and advancements that Western civilization has brought to the world? Without globalization, we wouldn't be able to connect to each other every day through Zoom, which is the product of globalization. So people are saying, oh no, we're going to lose our means of communicating, and we have become a globalized world. What becomes of my friends and family here and there? And then if not globalization, many communities would be still trapped in superstition, devoid of knowledge, which got transmitted to global communities through globalization. Well, I would say that the idea that indigenous cosmovisions and knowledge systems were just superstition is something that maybe Bayo would like to just unpack as part of this monoculture of mind. But who would like to take this question about the so-called trade-offs and the benefits that globalization has apparently given us, and what are we prepared to give up, and what are you saying that we need to leave behind, and what could potentially stay with us? Helena?
Well, yes, I want people to understand that globalization is a process whereby governments are giving global monopolies, in other words, giant corporations that pay no tax, that have no regulations. The governments are actually signing, in the name of free trade, the freedom for Monsanto, for Cargill, ExxonMobil, HSBC Bank, to do as they please, complete freedom. So not only are they signing that in black and white, but they're saying, if we do something to protect our environment, that would mean that you have less profit. Or if we want to have a minimum wage, we can't do that. You will take us to court, and we will go to court, and we're willing to let you sue us, government. Now, we do not need to hand over rights to global corporations to run the world, to run our governments, and very importantly, in so doing, running the media, academia, science, the school books, the writing of history, to create one monoculture, as Bayo was referring to. And this is the white mind, it's the monocultural mind, it's the white mind. And now there are Africans and Chinese and Indians who are part of that. They've been educated into that monoculture. And the monoculture says, yes, this is the only way that people can communicate. And without this, there'd be no trade. And we'd all be living in the dark ages. No, we can have trade. As Bayo was saying, trade for thousands of years was global. For thousands of years, there was so much more communication than you would imagine. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to communicate if that's what we want to do, as we are now, without handing over the right to global corporations to run our government and to control the data and the scientific research to suit extractive profit that brings money to billionaires who are already extremely wealthy, and that makes the majority of people poorer. So I actually think if people understand globalization, I think there would be, I really believe there would be no people who would openly be able to support it, because it's so outrageously anti-democratic, it's so outrageously anti-values that you can defend. You'd have to be defending the destruction of life itself. You'd have to be defending that, so we need to be talking about how the technologies of communication today are being used by a financial casino, investors who invest in Ladakh, where you come from, Stanzin, who invest in other parts of the world without any idea of what harm they're doing. They'll often be telling themselves that this is ethical investment in the name of climate, they're doing good. They might be talking about planting trees, and that means bunging up monocultures, as you've seen the government do in Ladakh. Even the government has been responsible for tree planting that is completely unecological. So, yeah, when it comes to the realities of what most people need, what most people want, we do need to be looking very critically at this globalization, the reality of this imposition of top-down monoculture to extract wealth for the few at the expense of the many. And we need to be also looking at how some of these communication technologies used in the wrong hands are very destructive. But if we get democratic processes, we can decide that these communication technologies are very valuable for very beneficial use, and we want to maintain them, but we don't want them in the hand of a deregulated financial casino, for instance.
Mm.
Thank you, Helena. Please jump in if you want, Bayo. I actually want everybody to answer this question about, the people who say, what about all the good things?
Yes, what about all the good things? What about all the good stuff? The Zoom, the Netflix, we have to Netflix. Well, it would seem to me that there are certain presumptions, or hidden assumptions in the question, and that need a wrestling with, a tangling with. Let me name the first one as, and I'm dancing through the upbeat of Helena's already seemingly complete response. But let me offer this, that the first one seems to me to be the presumption of convenience, that these technologies are created for our convenience, that they're just outside of us. We have Netflix, we have Coca-Cola, we have all this technology. It's outside of us, and it's created for our good. But that's only part of the story, because we are learning in increasing doses the hidden curriculum and the hidden costs of these supposed technologies of convenience. We're learning that, for instance, we are increasingly becoming plastic creatures. I don't know if people here are learning about the swirl and the dance of microplastics, and how they're not just in the environment, they're not part of our bodies. They're in the air, they're in the water, they're in our bodies. That disrupts the idea that technologies are outside of us. We're trying to say here that we are being engineered ourselves It's not just that we're using technologies, it's that we are being used by our technologies. We're changing as well. So the idea of the master who is just enamored of his tools is broken down when we realize that the world is much more promiscuous than those ideas of a binary between the master and his tool. So there isn't, the story, the narrative that we will lose all these tools if we give up globalization is disrupted when we realize that we are being lost ourselves. We're being changed in this biopolitical dynamic that is increasingly dangerous. And I'm going to use the language of Michel Foucault, right? The second presumption is the assumption of utopia, right? That we're heading towards, an increasingly progressive line. And by some dint of hard work or technological singularity, we will arrive at a bright and shiny day. And it's all these assortments around us. I think every world comes with its shadows. If you must have a world where Elon Musk and his phallic rockets are the dominant technologies of choice, then you have to also have a world where mental distress is normative. If you have a world where the only way to get food is to import it, and that the immediacy, the sensuous immediacy of ecological presence is distanced, right? We only think about food as coming from a large distance. If you must live in that world, then you also have to get what comes with the genie as well. There is no world that comes, I'm very suspicious about utopian projects. There's no world that doesn't come with shadow. We're saying here that the technological supremacy of white modernity may have gifted us some kinds of resources, but it has also taken and enacted a serious tax on futures, on livelihoods, and on possibilities. So there is no utopia to be had here. We have to struggle. We have to wade through an entangled and, elaborately material world. And we will never arrive. I feel the gift of localization is not to say, here's heaven. Here's heaven. And if you situate yourself in this theoretical framework, then all our problems are solved. That doesn't seem to be the gift here. It's saying our lives are this way. It doesn't have to be this way. Be very suspicious of what people present to you as nature, right? There is an undertone here. There are undercurrents here. There are shadows to what has been presented to you as natural experience. If you investigate further, life can be more beautiful than how we have it now.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think localization and globalization can create the idea of a false dichotomy that can be a bit of a trap. As Helena and Bayo referenced, our ancestors traded far and wide. There were red feathers found from the Amazon in the Northeast, Native American tribes. So the Chumash traded with the Polynesians. And I think that really what localization is asking us all to do is look at our history of displacement and how that displacement creates a very vulnerable background, a very vulnerable situation for all the participants, that whatever tech utopia is sold to us is inherently going to be not fair. It's not going to create equality. Growing up in Southern California, in Orange County specifically, I grew up in one of the more colonized places in the world, arguably, and in displaced places in the world for a lot of the people that live there. And I think that it really made me interested in nature, and I really studied nature. And through that, I've learned that, we all know that nature is it's not a fair place. It's a place that you need to kind of inhabit, and it promotes and it helps you through the microbiome and all the things we're learning. or we're calling names in science now, but it's infinite, that it really, it wants to help us like participate in the best way possible. So in learning about that and thinking about that kind of mindset of surfing, and I think I've studied anthropology, and in anthropology, there are very few kind of common things that create a delineation between an egalitarian society and a hierarchical society. And one is this reversed dominance hierarchy theory. And our ancestors, because of their rootment to place, their innate knowledge of where they came from, they had a variety of mechanisms in which they could challenge hierarchical situations. For 98% arguably of Homo sapiens existence, we lived in very egalitarian bands, and those became empires, and different things happened. But there was a few things. People had access to poisons, and they had access to weapons, and knew how to use them, because they were all involved in their place. They were all involved in procuring food, medicine, fiber, shelter. And they could, if some chief came in and was sleeping with your daughter, you could kill him, or you had the ecological literacy to leave and to be somebody who could participate in a new society adjacent to yours, a bioregion in which your skills could overlap and mosaic onto others, and you could nature, and us being, these bands being emergent from nature, you could create value. What we're quickly seeing is the average person losing all of these skills. They're therefore losing a lot of their ability to have agency and to have leverage. And so we can be gaslit by our media that, inflation's not that big of a deal. Food doesn't cost 3 times as much as it did a few years ago. Like we have no leverage. So therefore these technologies are increasingly centralizing power. And that is the superstructure that we're finding ourselves. Nature is all about leverage. Symbiosis happens when two things can find common leverage with one another. The average human being is losing a lot of our leverage. So I think it's this globalization, localization thing is kind of, it's really an invitation for us all to see that by rooting into our places, by developing our communities and our literacy, our ecological literacy, that we're empowering ourselves to participate with technology. We're empowering ourselves to participate in a global economy in a way that we have agency, we have a say, and we're quickly going down a road which it's a fake world, and it's not going to be good for us unless we open our eyes.
And I think it's also an invitation to look at things like, just rethink entire systems. For example, you touched a little bit on like justice systems. We think that the justice system given to us by Western civilization is the pinnacle of, human freedom and liberty and justice for all. But look, the people at the top get away with the most thieving and stealing, and they act with impunity, polluting and exploiting, and it's the people at the bottom that suffer. This is a product of this, so-called Western civilization. And in many cultures on this continent of Abya Yala, before the arrival of the Europeans, that there were justice systems that were completely inverted, where punishment was doled out according to your rank. So if you were of a lower rank in society and you committed a crime, your punishment would be way less than if you were of a higher rank in society and committed a crime. This is for the Mexica community in Mexico. And so I think it's just an invitation also to really question what we've been told is just like the pinnacle of human evolution, and question all of these systems Cyrus touched a little bit on that. So I want to go to Stanton's next question, and I'm sticking with his questions because he's being wonderful in that he's playing devil's advocate, and he's asking all the questions that I come up against when I try to talk about this topic to people. And I think it's good for us to touch on these. For example, he talks about the Green Revolution and this idea that, for example, India would have starved without it. He says from 1960s, before 1960s, India was on the verge of famine and it was a country of ship to mouth, net importer of food. But then after the 1960s, after the Green Revolution came there and that technology was adapted and adopted, which was the product of globalization, they were able to solve famine and meet the demands of a growing population. So Helena, what do you say to that? That we would starve without the modern corporate agricultural system, and that the Green Revolution was a good thing, and without it we would not be able to feed ourselves, and that big ag feeds the world.
Well, for one thing, we saw in Ladakh that the government produced completely fake statistics about the yields in Ladakh, and we're told that using DDT and other outlawed pesticides, as well as chemical fertilizers, we're going to increase yields. We measured the yields in Ladakh in those years and found that the traditional yields using animal power and people power and no other technologies, the yields were higher than the average yields in America using millions of tons of fertilizer, pesticide, etc. So I'm afraid that the arguments that India would be starving and the help with the growing population of the Green Revolution is based in false statistics and lies. You have to remember also that in the census in India, farmers are not even mentioned. So we're looking at what happens when people are driven off the land into mega cities, and that does produce a lot of problems. And there can be food shortages because of that system. So it's complex, but we have to be very, very, very wary of the dominant narrative. It's full of lies. And you must study Howard. I think his first name was Albert Howard or Alfred Howard, who came from England earlier in the very early 1900s to help the Indians to grow food. And he, over the years, discovered that India had far more to teach England about growing food than England had to teach India. So there's a narrative that has been funded by the winners in this extractive capitalist game. And it has, as I say, we very clearly saw that it was based on essentially lies. I mean, as it happens, those statistics in the books that said that the Ladakhi yields were much lower than they were not even based on measurement. They were based on the assumption these people have nothing, and what we do is going to improve yields. But they did also actually have statistics that were completely wrong. So I'm afraid that in order to get a truer picture of what's going on, we have to look at, as it were, the people's history of the world, the bottom-up realities, that many of which are coming to light now. But do also, Stanzi, be sure to study Howard and his research and his book based on his many, many years in India.
Yeah, and also if you deconstruct that question a little bit, India, it comes back to microcosms adding up to the whole. In the before the 1960s in India, well, that was post-British colonialism, Before that, it was pretty okay. And India as a whole is a sum of a lot of different tiny bioregions. There's mountainous places, there's swamps, there's marshes. All of those had their own ways of doing things. And this idea that some umbrella green technology is going to solve something is the false promise of capitalist modernity, in which, oh, we have an umbrella solution, it's going to make everything better. And when in reality, it's trying to simplify nature and the best profit, we're on a quarterly profit-driven economy. The best profits can be found by fighting nature. So if you can fight, disease, and you can fight pests, those are all nature's way of creating more diversity, because diversity is security. And so monocultures in this whole modern society that we're in, and these stories that we've been told, it's like we have these parables. I mean, my documentary talked a lot about Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution, and Swami Nathan, and like how, it's one of those stories that are held up in Golden Rice. And, you look at Vandana Shiva's work and her interviews with people and farmers and with Golden Rice and the suicide rates. I mean, it's propaganda. Um, and it's this umbrella philosophy that I think yeah, anyway.
Yeah, Cyrus, I just want to say it could have sounded to Stanzin as though you were saying that Vandana's work was propaganda, but what you were saying was that Borlaug and Swaminathan's Green Revolution, monocultural, top-down message telling the whole world that we need the Green Revolution to feed the world, that is propaganda. And Vandana is one of the people who showed that this was simply untrue. And it's a very good point you made also, Cyrus, that absolutely after the colonial powers in India left, they created this mess of urban fossil fuel, energy-intensive development. It was because of that centralized model also that India ended up with much more violent conflict, etc., just as in Ladakh. I don't know if Bayo also wants to say something about that.
Okay, well, Stanton has followed up with another question about, well, what about the increase in life expectancy and literacy rate? And I want to jump in, and it really follows up. I'm just following up on the point that Cyrus and Helena made, that a lot of these statistics relate or pertain to communities immediately post-colonization. So you're talking about communities that were ravaged by diseases, by violence, by displacement, totally severed from their ancestral ways of growing food, now becoming fully reliant on this global economic system. So of course, when you come in with this, so-called, the technological advances of the so-called Green Revolution, and then, oh, now we're educating people. And if, of course, your statistics pertain to immediately post-colonization when they were able to start gathering data, of course it's going to look good. But they don't have the data on what things look like pre-colonization, which now archaeology and archaeologists are showing us that the Amazon rainforest supported over 10 million people living in the rainforest. They had sophisticated societies, feats of engineering. I mean, this was considered just wilderness full of primitives. And now we're seeing that these were actually highly evolved, sophisticated societies that were living so harmoniously with nature that it was almost impossible to find a trace of them, because they basically left no, trash or ecological damage. In fact, the only what they left behind, their legacy, was this increase in biodiversity and what looked like this amazing so-called wilderness. And with regards to literacy, I just lived in the Amazon for 5 months, and okay, great, we've brought, these indigenous children can now read and write Portuguese, big thumbs up. None of them know how to grow their own ancestral food. These are the children who are the descendants of the people who created the Amazon, who created the technology of Terra Preta. None of them know how to grow that anymore. They're all reliant on eating plastic food that has been wrapped with plastic and flown halfway across the world, which is now trashing the waterways and the soil in the Amazon. But we give that 2 thumbs up because they have a literacy rate now. So I say literate in what? They've lost all ecological literacy, all of their ancestral knowledge. I don't think we should give them 2 thumbs up because they can read and write Portuguese and now they can go, work in a factory for some multinational corporation. So I think also there has to be like a big, reframe of what we consider progress, as we said, which is like, the main theme of this conversation. So I want to get back to some of these other questions. So a bit more of a, we can now move to like a little bit more of like positive. What do we do? Where do we go from here? What does this look like? So Che says that it was a very inspiring short movie. He had goosebumps throughout. So he uses something called AMAP in Paris that enables him to buy directly from a small farmer collective close to the city. They provide him seasonal local produce. But what other steps can we take to create impact? And what should we avoid doing? Helena or Cyrus, anyone jump in?
Oh, Helena, please, you go. I see you're on mute. I can go after you. Okay.
Oh, you go.
Okay. We could go back and forth and say, you go, you go, you go. And that would take all the time. Well, I just wanted to add a little bit to what Nathalie said about the two thumbs up for these indices of progress. That the Yoruba people had such sophisticated communicative capacities. I met with, and I've spoken about this a lot, with practitioners of healing arts back in Nigeria, who would tell me how they could speak with plants and hear them. It might sound so utterly outrageous to people who hear that today, that they knew what plants to give, to sacrifice, to heal human bodies. They knew these things without literacy, right? There were a deeply, orality was the complexity of the Yoruba tradition. And then we were colonized by British missionaries. And like Manish said in that, in the movie, that when they came with pencils, and they came with a Bible, and they came with a cross, and they taught us certain ways of being in the world. And this always to the exclusion of other complexities. So these indices, these marks of progress, are obscurations of other potential modalities of abundance, right? Orality is just as complex and promising and sophisticated. And our ability to speak in English today is some kind of a trap, which is one I acknowledge that I sit in, and I'm still incarcerated in. I don't speak my language as well. But to the question of what do we do now? Well, this is what this movie is about. It starts here. This is a pedagogical invitation and entrainment that other futures and other worlds are indeed possible. I think it starts from there, from realizing that we're not as incarcerated as we think, that closure has hidden openings, and we can start to feel our way through for them. Localization, in my sense of things, is not a top-down, standardized introduction of doctrinaire methodologies. Like, this is exactly what to do now, right? I feel it invites us to stay with the openings around us, that those places where we stumble, those places where we don't measure up to the globalized standards that are constantly, in dynamic placemaking, continuity. I think our work is to inhabit those places. I think of it as inhabiting cracks, like the places where the ground opens up, the places where the categorical image of the good citizen flails and fails, is an invitation for us to play and experiment. It might look like meeting your neighbor, really meeting your neighbor, as simple as having a conversation. It might look like planting a garden, if you have such provisions, right? It will look very small, and it may not even rise to the standard of what we think as political, right? It may not look like resistance on a large scale. But before we rush to notions of scale, let's think that worlds do not turn on those ideas of scale. Worlds turn on the softness and the molecular nature of relations. So this is really a challenge to how we relate with plant, with ecology, with environment, with each other, and to the notion of pathology, which is my specialty, to the idea that we are not well until we look like this, right? Psychopathology is another conversation to have, and mental health, that's another conversation to have. The wellness industry, potentially $1 trillion industry, is another monoculture of mind that coddles us into frames of adherence. And I want to say that those places where we do not add up are places of deep resistance.
Very good. And also let's remember that localization by being that adaptation to diversity, to the billions of people on this planet, to the place where they are, who they are, it is exactly the opposite of a top-down imposition. It's the bottom-up creation and the liberty of building something from that diversity that is life, you know. So by connecting to life, by connecting to the people around you, you are connecting to that diversity, and you're building on that deep dialogue, which keeps us humble. It keeps us in feedback loops with the complexity of life. Every individual is unique. Every individual is changing. Every leaf on every tree is individual and changing. The mystery, the magic of life is this infinite, ever-changing diversity and interaction. The quantum reality, nothing exists in isolation. That is the reality. Nothing exists in isolation. You do not exist in isolation. You've been sold from this top-down mechanistic view that turned you into a cog in a wheel in a machine. You've been trained to think of yourself as this isolated individual, and you've been pulled into a world that has tried to create an artificial reality that ignored the truth of life itself, the inextricable interrelatedness, the constant change. We had a worldview that completely rejected that and said, well, we're going to build something better than that. We're going to build that concrete world. We're going to build that plastic world. And now we're going to build humans that are robots. We're going to supplant human life with robot life, and that is superior. We don't have to die. We don't have to deal with the messiness of the cyclical nature of life. It's extremely dangerous and deadly, and it won't last. And it's only a few tiny minority of people who are actively pushing for that artificial path. There's huge skepticism around the world, but we're hoping to encourage much stronger resistance, much clearer resistance, so that absolutely mechanical plastic reality. And that does create major epidemics of depression, because it is so deadly, it is so competitive. It leaves you feeling that unless you're a star in an 8 billion, persons, on an 8 billion person stage, you are nobody. As we come back to the local, to the living community, we are all seen and heard, we're all famous. There is a huge win-win-win about coming back to place, coming back to the smaller, the slower, and being open to that infinite diversity and the game, and as Bayo likes to say, the promiscuity of life.
I love the promiscuity of life. Big fan. Love that phrase. Thank you, Bayo. So I'm seeing a question or a comment here from the wonderful Evan Harrison, who's the CEO of Kiss the Ground, a wonderful organization that works with regenerative agriculture and is actively working to write a new farm bill here in the USA and to challenge this, the disproportionate subsidies going to big ag and instead channel them to local farmers. It's a wonderful organization doing amazing things. Quick recap for those of you who haven't heard the term regenerative agriculture. I came across it a few years ago after the devastating fires in Australia, and that agriculture and the really terrible industrial agriculture sector of Australia was really responsible for drying up our aquifers and cutting down a lot of our forests. And anyway, so when I found the movie Kiss the Ground, I felt my hope was renewed that agriculture didn't have to be the problem. It could suddenly be the solution. And I'd always seen cows as being really vilified, but then through Kiss the Ground got to see that, in many places in the world, they can recreate some of the animals like the buffalo that had been lost, and through rotational grazing we can actually build soil health. So I was on the board of this wonderful organization for a few years, and they do amazing work. And then I got to COP in in Egypt, and I was excited to see that they were doing a regenerative agriculture panel. And when I looked closely, I saw that it was being hosted by Nestle. I could not believe that, that they had been given that kind of a platform. So obviously I showed up to see what it was about. And there they were, Nestle, one of the largest companies of the world, like most responsible for water pollution, for soil degradation, for biodiversity loss, actually having the balls to be up on a stage telling people that those were the pillars of their new farming system and that they were now on board with regenerative. And, a few months later, I had a conversation with Helena, and she was like, Nathalie, that term, as good as it is being co-opted. And these corporations like to stay one step ahead of us. At first it was sustainability. Now all the buzz is regenerative. And now you have a company like Nestle claiming that they're making regeneratively farmed products. And so what do you have to say, Helena, to people who, like wonderful people like Evan, who's in devotion to this amazing organization that do amazing things, but how can we avoid the pitfalls of having these terms being co-opted? And why is localization a term that corporations will never be able to co-opt, and why we should try to bring all these wonderful modalities and ways of thinking under the umbrella of localization?
Well, actually, the term localization, they can co-opt. So I'm saying we need to systemic, holistic way to talk about shorter distances between the farm and the table. We need to talk about diversity above ground, not just in the soil. We need to talk about more people on the land. And in order to do that, we have to bring in literacy. The local market demands diversification of the product. The global market from the outset of this modern top-down market. So global trade before was never top-down. It never went via an elite system of traders. It went people to people across the world. It wasn't through these always intervening, these giant monopolies intervening, so that the farmer in the supermarket gets 10% of what we pay. If they're lucky, 10% of what we pay. In the local farmers market, they get 100% of what we pay. So we're talking about a fundamental shift. And when we look at the most important areas today, we do need to, and I'm glad you're doing that in Kiss the Ground, really focus on food and farming, because that's where it is truly scary to have governments that are separating us further and further from the source of our food, and as part of that structural shift, imposing monocultures, and now monocultures using even more technology, using even more scarce minerals, energy, and resources, and replacing even more people, just dumping them, when in fact, now human beings are this renewable resource, and it's a bit of an overabundant resource, whereas more scarce minerals, more energy is responsible for the pollution and the destruction we see. So we need to use holistic language. We need to be talking about the system. Let's never again just talk about the mode of production. Let's not just talk about, is it organic, is it biodynamic, is it permaculture, is it regenerative ag? No, we're talking about a food system that is concerned with food security, that is concerned, as I say, with diversification instead of monoculture, and that also understands that part of what's going to save the world and heal us all is to slow down and scale down. And that is a direct antithesis to the dominant path of progress, but holistic, systemic description.
Yeah, I think that the question of how can things be protected from being co-opted, I don't think they ever can. In our atomizing language of English, that's militaristic, context that covers 70% of the planet, everything that we are defining, it's actually squiggly, and it's actually a relationship. And so we're pinning reality down by our words, and like what Bayo's talking about, of like reality is promiscuous, and it's always going to be a journey, and it's always going to be a conversation, and it's always going to be an unfurling. And discussions like this, I think, they're one part, they're decolonizing each other and looking at these superstructures that we don't quite understand. And allowing us to peel back the layers of our values, and why we make the assumptions that we do, like life expectancy rates, to the previous question, and the not factoring in infant mortality, and how people, once they got past a certain age, they lived very long lives, healthy lives without chronic, with much less chronic disease. What's the quality of life? What does that take into consideration? And then literacy rate, is it this colonialistic language, or is it a language that's maybe spoken, or maybe we didn't need to speak as much because we felt a lot more. We were a part of what we were. We were enmeshed in our surroundings. And then I just want to say something to the piece of what are the solutions. The solutions can be, like, I think of what we're in right now as it's an ideological blitzkrieg of this search for singularity. We have this obsession with finding the ultimate truth. And it can go back to Greco-Roman philosophy, where you had these people who are insulated from, the original, in our history books, Western empires, who were debating over what ultimate truth was. They had an obsession with this ultimate reality, and what's ultimately happening. And that's inherently a colonialistic, empirical way of thinking, because you want to find this exportable whole, this truth. A tribe at the top, or a band, the pre-Incan societies at the top of the Andes would never presuppose that their values would be the same as tribes at the bottom of the Amazon basin. Values, languages, songs, they were all heavily context dependent, and they were only served the utility of helping those people exist in the niches that they inhabited. And diversity of opinion was celebrated. The diversity created surpluses to trade. And our whole idea now, there is so much, like, there is so much technology in a seed. There is so much just having animals now, and growing food, and planting fruit trees, and being in relationship to now for almost 10 years. It's like, I see, there's all of this, it feels like quantum technology, where everything's trying to be wrapped in an umbrella, where a sheep that goes limp when you shear or slaughter it, that puts on so many calories from the back 2.5 acres of my land, will grow from being a little lamb to almost as big as its mom 2 months later, and has that much meat, and drank everything that it ever had from the creek, and everything it ever ate from the rain, the plants. And like, the sheep or the goats that do that, and the ducks, and I mean, all of this has been bred. There's so much opportunity for us to team up with life and this long-term technology made from the sum of generations of humans' decision making, to imbue those animals with certain characteristics that have formed in relation with us, like in our dormant pathways of ways that we can connect with each other. There's such a sumptuous existence waiting for us that technology can layer onto. But we've been shown this really reductive, callous view of the world, in which we can't trust each other, in which we need, the capital S state to be our daddy. It's supplanting the masculine, where the feminine is now feeling empowered, but the state's their daddy, the big state. And there's so many things right now that are making their mental health, upside down, because we've lost this. We've tied our value to these fiat currencies that are debt. We're slaves to being indebted to other people, and our psychological terms for one another of narcissism and gaslighting, like, that's the superstructure we're in. It's a narcissistic gaslighting paradigm. And yet, when you get off money that is made to be devalued, and you start planting trees, and that tree grows, and all of a sudden every year it makes more fruit, it creates more shade, it creates more fodder for animals to eat. You're in an expansive paradigm. And I think that's the opportunity here, is to see an expansive, exponentially growing opportunity, as opposed to one that is heading towards singularity. And singularity, any time in nature where diversity collapses, that's a cataclysmic event. That's a catastrophe. That's a monoculture happens after a huge landslide. That's when weeds start popping up. Weeds are our first line of defense. Viruses do the same thing. When there becomes too much of something and it becomes a monoculture of an animal because it has no natural predation, because something wiped it out, a virus will come in and create complexity again. And so, like, literally our capitalism is a death. It's a whiteness is like devoid of light, like, or devoid of color. It's like it's we are in a death world, and we can come into a life world.
Thank you,
Thank
brother.
you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, brother. That was I felt sad when you started to speak about this loss of diversity and the ways the decontextualization of life has impoverished even the ways we speak with each other, right? The Greco-Roman inspired notions of an ultimate truth, what it hides from view are all the technologies and ways that reality is still an open-ended, always adolescent thing, still seeking and still touching itself, right? Yes, the ultimate is always penultimate. There isn't a final thing to arrive at. And maybe just what I wanted to tease from that beautiful offering you just gave us is that we also ought to be careful about reducing this narrative, this very, very promising and buoyant and alive narrative to a dynamic of heroes versus villains, right? There's a temptation of thinking about a reptilian conspiracy. I'm making it as cartoonish as I possibly can. Like there's some bad guys down there and there are some good guys and it's us against them. I think that is also how whiteness thinks. That's also how monoculture thinks. We're thinking about how life, how Helen, this is what you said about systemic readings here. And systems are different from individuals, right? If we reduce our critique to individuals doing bad things, we lose sight of the processes that gave birth to those conditions that make those individuals do the things that they do. So our work. I'm going to invoke some biblical language. Our work is not about pulling down people or canceling people. Our work is about engaging with principalities and powers. Cancellation politics is also part of how whiteness thinks, right? Let's just take down this atomic thing and then the way is free. We ought to be very cautionary and cautious rather about that kind of modality. Our work here is to engage systemic tendencies that move along the lines of neurotypicality and perform a geometry of experience that excludes us from the abundance of a world that is open-ended and prolific. And our work is to stay with this trouble long enough to share the seeds of the soil with each other, right? This is what I think about as fugitivity. Our work has to, dismiss and reject and refuse the values of giant scale recognition. Localization is not a product. And this is my own response to that question. How does it move away, right? We have to be cautious as well, but it is not a product, which means it cannot be standardized, which means that UNESCO may not like it, right? But that's the gift. That's the gift of this, that it is not a standardized offering. It is a sonorous invitation that will look different and it's contextual and is localized. Yes.
Thank you. It's a process and it's a systemic process.
Yes.
Exactly, looking at processes, systems, structures, and totally avoiding the politics of identity at every level. Romanticizing Black people over white people is part of the problem. The politics of identity is destroying us, and it's completely this bipolar, dualistic, mechanistic and imposed, as we know from the social media, imposed by algorithms that are on automatic pilot, extracting wealth to people who have absolutely no need for it, out of polarization, anger, hatred, violent conflict. It is so sad. So getting out of that system and waking up to how these algorithms are manipulating us is a very, very high priority. And again, as we turn local, as we turn face to face, as we I believe, refused to engage in the social media is the best way now. Look each other eye to eye, and in an embodied whole way try to communicate, but be very, very wary of being dragged into the polarization of the social media.
I wanted I want to say one thing about Stanzen's question about democratization of society from feudalism and casteism through modern justice systems. And this harks perfectly to what both Helena and Bayo, you guys said, is like globalization where we're at today isn't horrible. It's not the worst thing ever. It's not that we're proposing the white light and that's the shadow evil. There are good things that have happened, and we could spend a lot of time teasing out what all those are, but we're not today. But just to say that, one thing about feudalism is there was, based on the Roman, the Magna Carta, there was the commons, and when capitalism came in, which birthed democracy, democracy was emergent from capitalism. Within feudalism, people had access to common lands, and so therefore they had access to things that we don't even have now in a lot of societies. So it's complex, and there are a lot of things that have evolved and gotten a lot worse, and things that we've been pit up against past, we've been pit up against the past in a way that's unfair, in the context of, that in the question about India, and it's like it's a post-colonized society, and you're saying, oh, green rice or golden rice and green revolution helped them. There's parts of democracy. I mean, there's been golden ages in time, and to Bayo, your comment of like there's energies which have moved through. So post World War II America, we had a tremendous amount of wealth from that conflict, and we were the benefactors. And that energy created times that created beauty and created, art and expression. It's not all, but what happened during World War II hurt a lot of people. And so anytime that you have benefactors, or there's power surpluses in society, beauty can be created, just like Pacific Northwest tribes being surrounded by salmon runs had a lot of beautiful expressions in their potlatches, yet there was a lot of problematic aspects that one could potentially look at with those societies. So it's not that there's the myth, in anthropology, there's a thing called stagism, and it's this idea that it's the myth of progress, that we're getting to some better place. And we're never going to arrive anywhere without no lotus, or no mud, no lotus. It's like, it's about riding and looking at how the shadows and the darkness between the stars, like how they all interact, and feeling that, and deciding where in history, what parts we want to borrow, and how we want to iterate upon those things that have happened to try to create and invent the best futures that we possibly can. And right now, being local in an age of globalism that has been centralized in the hands of very few, and the power and the autonomy and the agency of the average person has been taken away, a local future is the way that we can do that.
Yeah, and I do want to say to Stanzin that we've got to look with honesty, and that means we're going to end up being very skeptical about the Western progress that's been imposed over the last 3 years, starting with a group of people in Europe, moving over to America, an economic system that has sold us a narrative about progress that actually, overall, in its totality, was not beneficial for the majority of people in a holistic way. It was progressively destroying ecological health. It was destroying human health, both physical and mental. It robbed us of the spiritual foundations that virtually every culture had teachings about, the inextricable oneness of all life. There was a fundamental understanding of that. This Western style progress rejected that and essentially said these man-made structures using lots of resources and being disseminated top down are good for us. Overall, they haven't been. But as Cyrus is saying, there are some elements that looked quite good. I mean, I would very much question how well people were doing in the modernity after the Second World War, while economists were arguing about whether they could actually impose consumerism on them. Consumerism has converted or perverted a deep universal human need for love, both to be loved and to love, was perverted to a need to consume. And little children were sold on the idea that if they had the latest running shoes, the latest technological gadgets, the latest clothing, they would get the love, approval, and sense of community that we long for. And it has exactly the opposite effects. It leads to deep alienation, competition, isolation. So there are, certain indicators of human and ecological well-being that once we start applying those, we have to fundamentally question that direction. But I think
Absolutely.
we're close. And I think, sorry, Cyrus, did you want to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what I was meaning in that too is like, with my animals, I have grain pellets, and the grain pellets help them come if they've gotten out of the fence line. And they eat those grain pellets and it's crazy for them. They love it so much. And it's like there are times like the Green Revolution across sub-Saharan Africa, the promise to the Punjab in India to farmers. It's this idea that, there's these gluts of our petrodollar supremacy in the West, that they can be really tantalizing for a few years, and that's the promise of modernity. But the long-term effects is what you're talking about, and it's looking at that bigger scale of time. And if my goats and sheep just ate these pellets, they would die. They'd get diabetes, So it's looking at those longer values that root us to, what we ultimately want.
I also just quickly want to say to you, Stanzin, thank you very much for your questions, and I'm glad to hear from you that you read my book. I'm coming back to Ladakh next year and hope to see you then. We're planning to have an international conference in Ladakh in September. I'm hoping that Bayo may join us, Nathalie will, all Cyrus as well, and certainly hope to see you, Stanzin. Thank you for staying with us.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I realized I didn't share much about my reason for coming to this movement, and maybe I'll close on that. But like I mentioned before, I come from a long line of farmers. We farmed the Andes for thousands of years. We fed also 10 million people without the one drop of glyphosate or chemical fertilizer. My grandmother has lived to be 101 years old and still going strong, has her memory, her body, everything intact. I think because of the amazing microbiome from having grown up in the Andes and mostly eating food her whole life that had not been contaminated with, glyphosate or even grown from GMO seeds, wholesome, beautiful living. Although what we would consider the rural poor. Sadly, I had two aunties die of cancer inexplicably. A few years ago, I was watching a film with my mom and my grandma that talked about DDT. And my mom had a flash, and she remembered that at some point my grandma had kept DDT in the house. And she asked my grandmother what she had done with it. And she said, well, we never used to use this product. But one year a man came along and he told us that it was everybody was using it, that the government had approved it, that it was good for lice. And he told us that we could use it on our children as well. And in that moment, we realized that my two aunties had died of cancer from exposure to DDT being placed directly on their heads at a young age. And I just, my mom told me not to, obviously we weren't going to tell my grandma what we knew about DDT, but I just remember going into my bedroom and closing the door and really grieving, like just the grief of thousands of years of ancestral knowledge interrupted, and this monoculture of the mind that caused my grandmother to think that somehow their knowledge system was backwards, and that these new people with this new shiny product was somehow the future and more progressive, and that in doing so she had unwittingly killed two of her own daughters. And it just made me realize, like, at that moment, I think, was when the illusion of this propaganda of progress just really crumbled for me. And I made it my mission to fight against these these entities that sell and push these weapons of mass destruction down our throats. And it was in that moment that I found Helena, and it was an honor to be asked to narrate this film. It was an honor to be asked to moderate this panel. I'm so honored that you guys have chose to spend 2 hours of your time with us today. And for those who want further reading, please look up Helena's other books, Ancient Futures and Local is Our Future. I'm excited to watch Cyrus's other film now. Maybe, Cyrus, you can tell us where we can find it?
Yeah, it's on my website, and also iTunes and all the rest of the things. But my website's just cyrussutton.com. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks. And Bayo, for all of you wanting to tune into Bayo's work, I've had the privilege of only hearing him speak live, but maybe someone else can speak to where we can see or hear more of his work. Maybe someone can pop that in the chat just now. But please Google him. I'm sure there's more interviews with him on YouTube. This is a topic that I've just immersed myself in the last few years, but hearing Cyrus and Bayo and Helena come together, I'm walking away so deeply enriched by this really nuanced and philosophical, beautiful conversation. But for more nuts and bolts of how to actually kickstart a local movement, local food movement, and local economy movement where you live, Local Futures, the website will have a lot more resources.
Yeah, we do have a lot of resources. If you want to do a PhD on localization, come to our website. We've been gathering information for 50 years, and a lot of it is on there. And that means also, importantly, the reports of first encounters. When Westerners traveled the world to conquer and raid and rape, very often their first description of native peoples was amazing, beautiful people, peaceful, democratic. And then a decade later, as they were trying to rob them of their land, these people were described as ignorant, violent tribals that deserved to be decimated. And of course, they were decimated as the foundation of this form of progress. But wonderfully, there's this huge cultural turning. There's a recognition of the importance of learning from the indigenous. And en route, there is a deepening and growing respect for the feminine. So essentially, ancient futures are indigenous futures, are feminine futures, are local futures, and nowhere are they pinned down into some static, never-changing reality. Nowhere would they claim to lay out a map for the entire world. The invitation is the deep immersion in diversity. Thank you all so much, Nathalie. It's such an honor to work with you. And Cyrus, I hope we're going to do more projects together. And Bayo had to jump off, as you could see, to another event, but I'm also very, very grateful for his taking the time right now. He is so in demand. And as he mentioned, we've been working together for more than a decade, and it's been wonderful to see how the appreciation for his important voice is growing all the time. Thank you, everybody.